Welcome, everyone. I'm Colleen Stover from the Aerospace Corporation, and this is episode 101 of the Space Policy Show. Space-based solar power. Why now? So imagine beaming down power from space to energize activities on Earth. Imagine that power is collected directly from the sun. And now imagine that power is virtually unlimited. Doesn't care if it's cloudy, doesn't care if there's no wind. It's a solar power station in space. So that's basically what we're talking about when it comes to the technology of today's topic, space-based solar power. CSPS's very own space economist and policy expert, Karen Jones, is back on the show, and she's talking to John Mankins. He's chair of the Permanent Committee on Space Solar Power at the International Astronautical Federation. He's also the author of the book, The Case for Space-Based Solar Power. And we have Martin Soltau. He's co-chair of the Space Energy Initiative. This is a UK-led global partnership. It was launched in 2022, and it focuses on net zero and achieving that balance between the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and that coming out. So let's just go over to Karen and get started.
Thank you, Colleen. And thank you, Martin and John, for being here today on the Space Policy Show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Karen.
Thanks, Karen.
Okay, so I'd like to start our discussion today with a major understatement. Planet Earth faces a huge climate and energy challenge. We have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions. This is an existential challenge, and the goal has become even more daunting as the world's population will reach 9.7 billion by 2050. And adding to this threat, many countries are facing increasing levels of industrialization. And the confluence of these two trends is pushing global energy up by 50% by 2050. So how can space-based solar power address this huge challenge? The concept originated back in 1968 with Peter Glaser from Arthur D. Little. And he introduced the concept. And since that time, the technology has advanced on several fronts to remove some of the technical and economic barriers to practical, full-scale implementation. The technology involves basically 4 steps. Step 1 is capturing space incident solar radiation, which is much higher intensity than on Earth. And it's 24/7, and it's not attenuated by weather or atmosphere. Step 2, the sunlight is converted from photons into an electrical current and then into a microwave energy form, which is beamed down to Earth. Then here on Earth, the microwave energy, after traveling 35,000 kilometers, is captured with a very large receiving antenna known as a rectenna, and it's converted from microwave beams back into electricity. Step 4 is the fun part. The electricity is integrated into the grid and transmitted to energy customers, or it could go directly to niche markets such as customers that would be, let's say, at post-disaster response sites or maybe forward deployed military stations. These would be niche markets. There's many advanced technologies and a lot of know-how that goes into supporting space-based solar power, including high-performance photovoltaics, wireless power transmission components, in-space servicing and assembly expertise, microwave beaming at high power levels and at very long distance, and the design and operation of ground receivers. However, from everything that I have read, it is not the technology that will necessarily keep space-based solar power from becoming a reality. Many of these technologies are at a high enough TRL level to be very promising and worthy of consideration. Instead, it is the economics and the commitments by government to research and invest. So that's how I want to start the conversation. US decision makers are now facing a pivotal moment as several countries continue to invest in this game-changing technology. Internationally, space-based solar power has enjoyed a resurgence. So my question, and I'll start with Martin and then go to John, is the US falling behind as other countries step up their commitment?
Well, I think, Karen, the US is got its military research programs by the US Air Force Research Laboratory and the Naval Research Laboratory. But the real important thing for advancing space-based solar power for commercial grid-scale energy is for the energy departments of governments to get behind this. It's an energy program, first and foremost, enabled by space. And so one argument is maybe the US does need to, policy-wise, accelerate their thinking and policy. But I think in technology terms, no, probably the US is as advanced as the other leaders, China and Japan, in the key technologies.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned in a previous conversation we have, and I think this is one of the focus areas for the Space Energy Initiative, is we have two communities. The energy community, and I was part of that community back in the day. I used to be in the oil business, and the space community. These are two sectors that do not typically talk to each other. How do you think that will play in the US to be able to get some commitment and traction behind space-based solar?
It's vital that the two do talk to each other, and that's in the UK why we set up the Space Energy Initiative. It was very much to bring the two sectors together. As you say, they don't even understand each other, and you'd find that energy companies would be nervous about investing in space, which they don't understand. And the Space Energy Initiative has taken the conversation to the UK government, and we've managed to influence policy. We have now space-based solar power in the National Space Strategy. We've got a funded program, small beer at the moment, but it is a funded program from the Energy Department in the UK, and we're talking internationally, supported by the International Department for Trade and the Foreign Office. So exciting times, and I really hope this will spur conversations in other countries, particularly the US.
John, I'd like to hear from you regarding international interests and the growing resurgence, and is the US falling behind? And what are the steps needed to step up our commitment?
So I think the point of view that Martin expressed a moment ago is really on target, namely that in terms of the key technologies necessary for space solar power, the US is doing very well. However, the principal emphasis of US activities at this moment are either altruistic and university-based. There's a major donation that was made some years ago to Caltech. They're doing very fundamental research. And on the application side, the US military is investing, as you mentioned, and their emphasis is on DoD applications. And so they're not really focused on trying to provide commercial power. And so from the standpoint of addressing the climate challenge and working towards delivering energy from space to help meet terrestrial, I'll say baseload energy needs, in that area, the US really has no significant activity at the systems level. But if I may, I'll just disagree in one respect, and that is that so far the conversation has really emphasized government investment. And I have to say, from a US perspective, I'm in California, that's not how reusable launch systems were created. The major US government players decided years ago they weren't going to develop reusable launchers, and that lowering the cost of launch was hard. And so we're going to work on our own missions. And it took a company player like SpaceX and another company player, Blue Origin, to actually redirect the conversation in the last decade on we can do low-cost launchers using research that's been done over decades. I think the same thing is true for space solar power. I think that with the right kind of government industry partnership, that progress could be made very rapidly, and more rapidly than a government only or a university only research program. And that's how we've gotten to low cost launch. That's how we could get to affordable space solar power.
Right. And certainly the space sector is becoming better at understanding how to put public-private partnerships together. And another promising trend is Caltech's investment of over $100 million by the Brin family to support the study of space-based solar. So that's promising. But getting back to international, China has been increasing its activity with microwave power beaming. And in fact, the China Academy of Space Technology, CAST, made a statement in 2019 that China is expected to become the first country to build a space solar power station with practical value. And so are we at a disadvantage here because they have this monolithic dedication to space solar power? And yes, if we pull together public sector, private sector, and the innovation that we have in the US, hopefully we'll compete. But do they have an advantage due to this type of commitment? I'll start with Martin, and then I'd like to hear from John on that.
Yes, I think inevitably they have an advantage in not needing public support for policy. They have very long-term planning. But there are a number of factors for success if we're going to develop grid-scale space-based solar power. I think one of the key factors is a really viable, economically viable concept. China may not need necessarily as a first of a kind to have something that's economic, but in the Western world we do. And so John's concept, SBS Alpha, which is very viable, Cassiopeia here in the UK, these sorts of systems are essential, I think, for success. And a development program needs to be built around a successful concept. I think the other thing is a race, a SBSP race, geopolitically, I think will potentially be a good thing, because that's what spurred the original space race back in the 60s to get to the moon. And on the other hand, a collaboration, again, there are advantages of that. But I think at the moment, the geopolitics will be really tricky to do collaboration with China in critical national infrastructure.
Right. And you know, it's interesting that as NASA approaches this technology, I'm wondering how we can reframe this issue a little bit. For instance, as we think about habitats on Mars, that habitat is not compared economically with building a large home in West Texas, which is slightly more bleak than Mars. So, and you can build a house in West Texas for, you know, around $200,000. No one's saying, let's do that comparison. These other space missions are not compared directly with terrestrial equivalents. So perhaps decision makers should give space-based solar power some recognition for its potential research discoveries and space exploration benefits. Now, in the Fraser-Nash study, which you were involved in, Fraser-Nash Consultancy issued a space-based solar power study. I think it was released in November 2021. The summary is it's feasible and affordable using levelized cost of energy. So it seems like in the right environment, at the right latitude, that it is competitive now, but it's not necessarily competitive everywhere. And do you think we should look at space-based solar power more in a research focus for now to give it some latitude to further advance? I'll start with, let's say, Martin, and go to John on that one.
The short answer is no, I don't. I think we need, because net zero is urgent, I think we need to take a programmatic approach and not just a research approach. There are many challenges, policy-wise, standards and regulation, political, environmental and technical, but none of these are insurmountable if we take a real, I'm going to say, sort of pandemic response approach. If we really believe that net zero is important, and I think most governments now do, then we have to treat this urgently. And as John was saying earlier, the underpinning technology is all there. It's a big engineering challenge, but there are no laws of physics problems. So I think for both investors and policymakers who have to set the right environment for this to succeed in policy terms, we must pursue a program approach.
And John, I'd like to hear from you. And also, Martin mentioned the environmental impacts. And I had a conversation recently with a friend of mine who's an ornithologist, and he is concerned about birds flying into this microwave beam. So I want to hear about that as well, because we talk about the economics, but what are those social challenges, social acceptance, and of course, the real concerns regarding microwave energy and whether it's safe or not.
So I wanted to just take a moment and circle back because I didn't get my moment in the sun on the international question.
Yes.
I wanted to circle back to the issue of the R&D and China and so on. I think they're making tremendous progress. Yeah. But and having a focused initiative this early on and having it led by a national organization, CAST, is extremely important. But on the other hand, I think the main point that Martin was making, that it's important not just to be working on a problem, but to be working on the right solution, is really critical to success. So even though they're doing a fabulous job, they're friends and colleagues, but I think the fact that they're not working on the solution that I believe is coming to the fore in the US, in Japan, in the UK, in Europe, which is a highly modular system solution that allows low-cost mass production of the pieces. I think that's the right approach, obviously, and that in that regard, we are not yet behind on the curve because their emphasis is on a more conservative and traditional systems approach. Now, I will just turn quickly to the question of space applications. And while I agree with Martin's point that the technologies are on the shelf in the lab, ready to go into applications, it's an engineering and design challenge more than a long-term research problem. Nevertheless, when you work on space solar power for terrestrial markets, develop those systems, do those demos, and so on, you have solved that problem of low cost, hundreds of megawatts of power anywhere in the inner solar system. And so it is those systems and those technologies, those modules, they are directly applicable to the industrial development of lunar resources. They are directly applicable with small modifications to the solar array side to power for the moons of Mars, for the Martian surface, for small bodies and the development of space resources and operations throughout cislunar space. I mean, whoever has megawatts of power at 10 cents a kilowatt hour will own cislunar space. And I think there's a major concern on the part of lots of analysts in the space policy sector. Lastly, you got one more. It's not my fault you had three topics. I got to get to all of them. And lastly, in terms of the environmental consequences. So one of the virtues of nature is that only relatively long wavelengths can get through clouds and rain in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum. On a cloudy day, it gets dark outside because short wavelengths like visible light are diffused rather substantially. Well, as it happens, due to the physics of wireless power transmission, when you go to long wavelengths on order 10, 12 centimeters, it turns out the power density is quite low, on the order at the peak of the beam of a couple of 100 watts per square meter, and at the edge of the beam on the order of 2 watts per square meter. Now, summer sun is between 800 in a clear day, 800 and 1,000 watts per square meter. And this is from 2 to 200 at the very peak. And so by the nature of wanting to be able to be all weather, space solar power, wireless power transmissions can be viewed as a very low intensity thermal add to the environment that birds, insects, mammals are going to experience anyway. And for most animal species and plant species, they're not going to be in the transmission anyway. Only flying insects and birds will really need to be concerned about. And as I said, it'll be a small add to the thermal load that we get on a July day anyway.
Right, and I like the way you compared that. That's something that people can relate to, essentially. You know, it is non-ionizing, and standing at the equator in full sun might be more harmful than being in one of these rectenna areas. But it is a question that I'm sure will come up again and again, and will need to be addressed along with safety standards for the power beaming aspect of this. But moving on, how might space-based solar be introduced, and how will it gain traction and grow? I've been trying to envision, what does this future market look like? What is that roadmap to development? And John, I'll start with you, but you mentioned the in-space applications. So a space-to-space application might be a practical way to roll this out. And absolutely, the modularity aspect of this is huge for a number of reasons. It makes it more addressable for different markets as well as more resilient. But what does that market development roadmap look like? What is the next step, starting with the prototype? And how will this eventually evolve and lead us to 2050?
So I think what has to happen to really sort of open the financial doors is a fairly significant ground-based demo at the systems level, a demonstration at the systems level. And I think that's got to be tens of kilowatts, and it's probably going to cost tens of millions. But that once that's done and it's at the systems level, then anybody who wants to see it can see it. It's not just a slideshow. It's not just an animation, or it's not just a description in a book. It's there. So I think that's the essential first step. Few tens of millions for a few tens of kilowatts. Secondly, I think this roadmap has to involve space demonstrations, not just of components, not just of a widget, or of a piece, some of which have already been done, but of a system. So I think a systems level demonstration, and that's probably hundreds of millions, small number of hundreds of millions, and a small number of hundreds of kilowatts in space. And then and then you have the prospect for actually scaling up with these modular systems to larger and larger sizes for the Earth applications, for the terrestrial markets. And I think that getting to that jump off point is a matter of years, not decades. So I personally don't believe it's 20, 30 years away. I think it's 6, 7 years away. And in the meantime, there is a tremendous market opportunity in space, which is already established in many space programs, and that is the development of the resources of the moon, the Earth's moon. If you look at the Space Force planning, if you look at planning for cislunar space, a recent report on the Space Industrial Base, You look at all the reason why 36 countries are going to the moon is because of space resources, the lunar ices. Well, the lunar ice that's been validated in the last decade or so is all sitting in cold traps at 40 degrees Kelvin. So it's dark, it's cold, and that's the reason why ices can exist in a vacuum. If you're going to extract those materials and make them economically viable and assist lunar economy, you've got to have energy. And although people talk about using maybe small nuclear reactors, if you look at water hydrolysis and mining and all of the required functions, it needs megawatts, and it needs it sooner rather than later. So I really think there's a great synergy between the ambitions that have been expressed in the last decade by China, by Japan, by the US, by Europe, and so on, from vis-a-vis the moon, and the need for space solar power to develop those resources and make that vision of a cislunar economy real. And I think it's all in this next 10 years. I think it's a really exciting time frame.
Thank you, John. I'd like to hear from Martin on the same topic, which is how will this roll out? But I'd like to ask Martin, how can government be part of this and de-risk the technology? How can we work and partner with governments and the US government to take a TRL level and increase it? Martin?
Yes. So I think I'm going to focus on, firstly, the commercial side, because space-based solar power gives the commercial market to develop all of the capabilities that we need for these other really important things that you're talking about, John, particularly kind of lunar exploration, resource utilization. But on the steps there, we're going to have to develop the routine, reliable ability to do proximity operations, assembly in space in particular, and rid ourselves of the need to put all of the spacecraft into one launcher. Combined with the incredible capacity of things like the Starship, SpaceX Starship, this is going to be game-changing when we can. And there are organizations trying to develop these at the moment, but if you've got a $1 trillion energy market incentivizing both governments and private investors to then get on and do this, that really is going to provide this huge economic boost to accelerate these programs. And it's I think this is one of the really exciting things about space-based solar power. It provides that commercial market. What's the role of government? The government has a really important role, I think, in various ways. Firstly, and to address one of the big risks on the roadmap, and doing this within a decade, I think, is the necessary regulation and standards that are going to be required to develop these systems sustainably and responsibly. Can we get that done? Because that's going to need international cooperation and negotiation, and that's probably a long pole in the tent. Secondly, government clearly has a role in underwriting risk for some investors, or advancing some of the early TRL work, or helping to bridge the valley of death. I think in particularly the third one is really in the setting the right environment internationally. We need this to be discussed in international forums, in energy forums, geopolitical sort of policy forums, the UN, as well as space forums. And so government has a key role. It's not just about funding.
Right. And I might add here, since the Fraser and Nash report came out in November 2021, energy prices have quintupled in the UK. So energy security is front and center with the new administration. I think Liz Truss mentioned that specifically last week. And I think it's something that we need to think about in the future, which is the economics of energy is changing quickly around the world, more in some countries than others, but that certainly has to be part of the equation.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And to just link that to the funding point, the government here is trying to underwrite the cost of energy to stop people falling into energy poverty. It really is a serious issue politically and society wise. And they're thinking of spending 10 times what John and I and others are proposing to complete the development of space-based solar power. They're thinking of spending £100 billion, $130 billion just on 1 year to support people's energy bills. Well, could we have 10% of that, please, to develop the solutions?
Yeah, right. And I don't think the solution is to drill and depend more on fossil fuels. I was in that business. I can tell you it's a finite resource. My family was in the business, and when I was in it, I was drilling wells down to 12,000 feet. My father drilled wells down to maybe 8,000 feet. My grandfather, 4,000 feet. We have to keep drilling deeper and deeper to get the oil or gas, and that's not going to continue. We have to stop kicking the can down the road. Having said that, there are a lot of renewable energy options, and this is one more option in a diverse portfolio, which could include nuclear, geothermal, wind, and terrestrial solar. It fits into that diverse renewable energy portfolio. I wanted to, get back a little bit to another question here, which is, how would we scale this up in terms of high efficiency wireless power transmission? How would we do this? I know that Naval Research Labs, NRL, has just repeated a power beaming experiment and there's been a lot of power beaming experiments lately. How can we scale this up to do a true end-to-end prototype that demonstrates space-based solar to give government decision makers and private sector investors enough confidence to invest? We've seen a lot of experiments going back 50 years on this, and I would argue that power beaming is maybe even a larger application than space-based solar itself. So I'll start with maybe John on this one, and then over to Martin.
So I think it all comes down once again to how you do it. It's doing it with the right approach, the right architecture that makes all the difference. So these demos have been done, as you say. Actually, demos of wireless power transmission have been done on occasion going back 60 years. And I honestly don't think that that the demos of power transmission make much of an impact on policymakers, on investment decision makers, because they're not at the systems level, because they don't demonstrate low cost, affordability, modularity, mass production. So I think the building a module, doing a test. This is something that the Naval Research Laboratory did recently. They've got in fact in flight in the X-37B. They've got a panel called PRAM. It's a wonderful technology demo. It's got PV, it's got RF. It's not influencing anybody's, nobody in Silicon Valley is saying, aha, now I can invest in space solar power. What you really need to do is develop a simple, clean, modular demo, and then make 100 modules and plug those together in an array in a simple way where you could easily make it 50 or 150 and then do it. I think it's not just doing the physics and the engineering, but showing the modularity, showing the assembly, doing the test in a way that can be scaled up or down and reconfigured. I think that's a critical part of a roadmap forward.
I just also like the spin-off research dividends associated with power beaming. But there's a lot of tech innovation and there's a lot of research spin-off dividends. I'd like to hear from Martin on this one as well. And also going back to the already published Fraser-Nash report discussing the various technologies that go into space solar and their TRL levels. I thought that it was interesting because since that report came out, I think some of those technologies may have advanced slightly since then. But I'd like to hear from Martin on that and where those research dividends might be and where we might see some innovation disruption in the energy sector.
Yes. Okay. So I strongly agree with you, John. The premise of the question is that the power beaming is the core technology. I think that's got to be done, as well as the manufacturing of the modules, and to show that it's a commercial proposition. We've talked to the Department for Energy here in the UK, and they've confirmed they would put space-based solar power into energy policy as well as space policy. Forgive me, I'm in the middle of a thunderstorm here, but it's good space-based solar power weather. All of those terrestrial solar farms are not working. And one of the things that we're focused on is a demonstration from space, from low Earth orbit, of meaningful power. So that's the right power density, delivering a few megawatts of power from space as an end-to-end demonstration, and to do that within 6 years. And that's the test that the government has said they would then put this into policy. And although we're not looking at government to be the primary funder, I think they do have a really important role in setting the policy, which then gets the energy companies really focused on this. With regard to spin-offs and other technologies, again, power beaming is being explored in terrestrial applications by a number of companies globally, and challenging things like getting the power back from offshore wind farms. It's incredibly expensive with fixed undersea cables and infrastructure. So there are applications like that. I think robotics, assembly robotics in space is going to be absolutely game-changing for all sorts of applications. And getting good at developing and operating these reliable robotic systems in very challenging, harsh environments is going to be a complete game changer. And so there's a whole range of spin-offs like this which help the investment roadmap for various types of investors.
Right. And as we think about investors and we think about the different markets that exist, I'm very interested in certain niche customer bases that might need power in a dispatchable way, on an as-needed way, such as forward operating military bases, disaster response sites, where there is no grid that's operating. That would certainly serve a huge advantage to the country that first comes up with this. They would have this kind of emergency power load, which wouldn't have to compete kilowatt for kilowatt, because it's a kind of a high level type of energy demand. And perhaps over time, as the energy from space becomes more economical, it could expand beyond these specific niche markets. But dispatchable baseload renewable power certainly offers a lot of promise to very demanding markets, remote regions, and specific customer needs. I want to move on to an important question to kind of wrap up the conversation and let you discuss whatever else you might want to. But recently in the press, space-based solar power is really high profile. But why now? Why are people talking about this now? I want to explore key themes such as economic development of space, energy security, which is high on everyone's list now, and of course, our net zero challenges for the planet. So I'll start with, I'll go with John on this one for why now. If you could tell me, why do you think now is the time for us to take another look at space-based solar power?
So I think one of the reasons, well, there are several reasons why space solar power is sort of risen back up in the discourse, both publicly and among space policymakers. And first and foremost, I think it has to do with the introduction in the last 5-7 years of truly low-cost launch, and this cracking of the shell that says space is hard, it's always going to be expensive, and therefore we don't have to work on it or think about it too hard. It's going to be a small fraction of the civilian economy. Well, in a couple of years, 3 years, 4 years, the cost of launch access to space is going to be well below $1,000, maybe below $500 a kilogram, whereas recently it was at $10,000 or $20,000 a kilogram. This is the fundamental shift. And that's why suddenly we are now actively thinking about getting global internet from space at a fraction of the cost of terrestrial fiber. Second, all of the technologies of the digital age, the power electronics and so on, they all depend on wireless interconnectivity. They all depend on battery life and high efficiency. These electronics are exactly the same electronics you need for space solar power. And so there's a huge leap forward in the component technologies and in the systems that they enable, like wireless mobile devices, like robotics in factories and mining systems and so on. That makes a huge difference. And I think lastly, and you alluded to this earlier, Karen, it's the recognition, which is sort of crashed down on the industrial economies, that climate change is not a crisis for our grandchildren. It's a crisis today. Now, we're already late. We should have been doing something 20 years ago, but we're not too late. But 20 years from now, it really will be too late. We'll be sailing past 1.5 degrees Celsius, sailing past 2 degrees Celsius. Anybody who owns beachfront property on the Thames, ought to be considering moving, because the ocean levels will rise. And so we have a short period of time to really develop new energy options and to do it quickly. And I had one more point I wanted to make about your earlier point. I could either do it now or later, as you wish.
Now is fine.
Okay, so the other thing that I was thinking about in your conversation a moment ago with Martin, you mentioned that it was dispatchable baseload power, and that really is unique. And I want to contrast space solar power to hydro, terrestrial solar, nuclear, wind. All of those others are fixed assets. They either are in your country or they're not. And in today's geopolitical tumult, it can seem quite frequently that assets in another country can't really be relied upon. Well, with an asset in space, a space solar power system, a satellite, solar power satellite, or SPS as it's called, you could put one up in space over the equator above Africa. And when you needed solar energy in the UK, you can send it to the UK. When, like the rainy day that Martin's got right now, that afternoon, you could switch it and provide that power to Kinshasa. The next morning, you could send that power from that same satellite to Cairo, or to Baghdad, or to Nairobi, and so there is no other renewable energy asset that will have the flexibility and the dispatchability of space solar power when fully deployed with satellites and receivers and so on. So it just has such tremendous geopolitical import. How could you not want to develop it?
Exactly.
Right.
And to add to that, if I may, Karen, it interoperates really well because it's dispatchable. It's not competing with the intermittent renewables. It's making them work as part of a system. And so, we need all of these things. We need wind and terrestrial solar and nuclear, but they don't work at the moment. And one of the reasons that why now is, particularly in the UK, the government does realise, and certainly the energy sector realises, that other technologies aren't there yet. The carbon capture and storage, battery storage that might possibly make these systems otherwise work, they're a way off by a couple of orders of magnitude in commercialization and scale and so forth. So we need these new options if we're going to get to net zero. And space-based solar power, as you were saying, John, has just got this unique set of characteristics that no other energy generation source has, which makes it really attractive to the commercial market. And it'll establish new ways and new markets for the energy sector and the space sector to play in the value stream. So that's part of why it's attracting huge interest.
Exactly. And when we think about getting back to the dispatchability, that saves lives. As you think about post-disaster response, as you think about the number of coalition deaths due to providing fuel to our troops in forward operating bases, when you think about the number of people that are possibly dying now in floods throughout the world and hurricanes, providing agile, dispatchable energy as needed is a huge advantage. I also like John's remark about really riding the coattails of space growth now. Citigroup estimates that by 2040, we're going to be looking at a $1 trillion space economy. And space-based solar can ride the coattails of that growth to some degree as well.
Well, Karen, I wonder if I could just challenge the statement you made there, that space-based solar power will ride on the coattails of the great space economic growth. I wonder if it's the other way around. The capabilities we need to develop space-based solar power will transform the economic growth of space, particularly routine robotics. I think it's the other way around. We need space-based solar power with its $1 trillion market to leverage this massive economic growth in space.
And if I may, I just make sort of a one other observation that traditionally space development, and especially the development of really low-cost launch, has been viewed and talked about in the literature as a chicken or the egg kind of problem. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? And I think it's in fact more of the lizard and the egg. Where we are right now, we have massive investments in the private sector and growing in the government to develop low-cost launch for the first generation of reusable launchers for the markets that we know today, things like global internet, global mobile devices, and so on, none of which existed 5 years ago. Well, 5 years from now, we could evolve to the next generation of commercial space development, the next generations of reusable launchers, and really take flight.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Martin, for your time today. We really appreciate your expertise. Thank you again.
Karen, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Look forward to doing it again.
Thank you, Karen. Great to be with you. And the rain has stopped here, which is good.
An excellent discussion. For some reason, I'm really excited about this technology. The potential just seems incredible to me. So be sure to check out John's book cover with a really cool graphic on what it could look like in space, space-based solar power. And of course, the CSPS publication about near-term investment decisions with space-based solar power by James Vedda and Karen Jones. And you can check out all of our shows on our website, csps.aerospace.org/space policy show. Subscribe to our newsletter or to us on your favorite podcast platform to get notified as new shows come online. So thanks always to James Liggins, our technical director, and we'll see you next time.